What Assyrian kings did to captured women was unimaginable. In the first millennium BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire carved its name into history with iron, fire, and a calculated system of terror unlike anything the ancient world had yet seen. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, centered on the great cities of Ashur, Nimrud, and Nineveh, Assyrian kings extended their dominion from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the Zagros Mountains to the borders of Egypt. They built the largest empire the world had known up to that time, and they maintained it not merely through military might but through a deliberate, state-sponsored ideology of fear. Among the most chilling aspects of Assyrian imperial practice, and one that has left a permanent scar on the historical record, was the treatment of captured women. To read the annals of kings like Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal is to encounter a recurring, almost ritualistic litany of violence directed at the women of conquered cities and territories. The inscriptions are explicit, not in the manner of a scandalized observer, but as proud declarations of royal power. The palace reliefs, massive stone panels that line the walls of Assyrian palaces, depict with brutal clarity the fate of conquered peoples, including women and children, in ways that were meant to be seen by foreign emissaries, tribute bearers, and Assyrian elites. Modern readers often recoil at these accounts, and rightly so. But to understand what Assyrian kings did to captured women, we must resist the temptation to dismiss it as mere ancient brutality. Instead, we must examine it as a coherent system, a gendered, psychological, and political strategy of empire. The treatment of women was not a side effect of war, it was central to Assyrian statecraft. It was a tool for breaking the will of conquered peoples, for erasing political lineages, for demonstrating the absolute power of the Assyrian king as the chosen instrument of the god Ashur, and for transforming the wealth of conquered lands into the economic and social fabric of Assyria itself. This account draws from the Assyrian royal inscriptions themselves, texts carved on stone stelae, clay prisms, and palace walls, as well as from the monumental reliefs that survive in the palaces of Nimrud and Nineveh. It also incorporates modern scholarly analysis from Assyriologists, archaeologists, and historians of gender and warfare. The goal is not to sensationalize, but to confront the historical reality with clarity and to understand how such violence was justified, organized, and remembered by its perpetrators, and what it meant for the women who endured it. The ideological foundations. The king as instrument of divine violence. To grasp the treatment of captured women, one must first understand how Assyrian kings saw themselves. The king was not merely a political ruler, he was the earthly representative of Ashur, the supreme god of the Assyrian pantheon. The king's primary duty was to extend Assyrian dominion, to bring order out of chaos, and to punish those who rebelled against Ashur's will. In this worldview, resistance to Assyria was not political defiance but cosmic rebellion. The royal inscriptions consistently frame military campaigns as divine missions. Ashurnasirpal 883 to 859 BC, one of the architects of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, begins his annals with a litany of titles that establish his divine mandate: chosen of the gods Enlil and Ninurta, beloved of the gods Anu and Dagon, destructive weapon of the great gods, king of the world, king of Assyria. When he describes his treatment of conquered cities and their populations, it is not with apology but with boastful precision. This ideological framework had profound implications for captured women. If the king was the instrument of divine punishment, then the suffering of the conquered was not merely permissible but necessary. It was a demonstration of divine justice. The inscriptions often state that the king acted in the strength of Ashur, my lord, or by the command of the great gods. The violence against bodies, including the bodies of women, was thus sanctified. Gender and the language of conquest. Assyrian texts reveal a deeply gendered understanding of conquest. The defeat of a city was regularly described in terms that conflate political submission with sexual domination. Cities that resisted were taken, entered, laid open, trampled, and shattered, a vocabulary that, in Akkadian as in English, carried connotations of sexual violence. The women of conquered cities were not collateral damage, they were explicit targets. Consider the language used in the inscriptions. When a city fell, the king often boasts of carrying off their women alongside goods, livestock, and precious metals. The phrase "I carried off their women" or "their women, their daughters" appears repeatedly across centuries of royal texts. The women are listed as booty, objects to be taken, counted, and distributed. But the inscriptions go further. They sometimes specify what was done to women, and here the language becomes even more stark. In some texts, the king claims to have flayed rebellious leaders and covered the city wall with their skin. Others describe impalement, beheading, and the public display of severed heads. And among these lists of horrors, the treatment of women is often singled out for special mention, not because it was exceptional, but because it was a particularly effective form of terror. The evidence of the inscriptions. Ashurnasirpal, the blueprint of terror. The reign of Ashurnasirpal marks a turning point in Assyrian imperial practice. He moved the capital to Nimrud Kalhu, rebuilt it on a grand scale, and filled his palaces with reliefs depicting his military campaigns. His inscriptions provide some of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of the treatment of conquered populations. In his annals, Ashurnasirpal describes a campaign against the city of Suru in the land of Bit Halupe. After defeating the city, he writes, "I built a pillar over against his city gate, and I flayed all the chiefs who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skin. Some I walled up within the pillar, some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes. I cut off the heads of the officials of the king of the land of Suru, who had rebelled, and I made a pile of them. I burned their young men and women with fire." The phrase "I burned their young men and women with fire" is significant. It appears in multiple inscriptions, and it indicates that collective burning, whether of individuals or groups, was an acknowledged tactic. The mention of women alongside men in such contexts suggests that gender did not offer protection from the most extreme forms of execution. Elsewhere, Ashurnasirpal describes his campaign against the city of Taylor. After taking the city, he boasts, "I slew many of them, and I captured many alive. I cut off the hands and feet of some. I cut off the ears and noses of others, I put out the eyes of many. I made a pile of the living and a pile of heads. I hung their heads on trees around the city. I burned their young men and women with fire." The repetition of this formula, burning young men and women with fire, suggests that this was not a spontaneous act of rage but a deliberate, repeatable technique of state terror. It was meant to be reported, remembered, and feared. Perhaps most chillingly, Ashurnasirpal provides an account of what happened to the wives and children of rebel leaders. After crushing a rebellion in the city of Suru, he writes, "I carried off the wives, the sons, the daughters, the silver, the gold, the property, and the goods of the chiefs who had rebelled." The phrase "I carried off UA" is a standard term for taking captives, but it masks a range of fates. Some women became domestic laborers in Assyrian households. Others were assigned to the palaces, where they served as weavers, grinders of grain, or domestic servants. Some were given to Assyrian officials and soldiers as part of the distribution of booty. And some, as other texts make clear, were subjected to sexual violence, either as a systematic practice or as a consequence of being treated as property with no legal protection. The expansion of terror. Shalmaneser 858 to 824 BCE, Ashurnasirpal's son and successor, continued and expanded these practices. His reign saw Assyrian armies push further west, coming into conflict with the kingdoms of Syria, Anatolia, and even Israel. The famous black obelisk depicts the Israelite king Jehu bowing before him. His inscriptions maintain the same brutal rhetoric. In an account of his campaign against the city of Eridu, Shalmaneser writes, "I slaughtered their warriors with the sword. I burned their young men and women with fire. I carried off the rest of their people as booty." Again, the formula appears, burning young men and women. But Shalmaneser's inscriptions also provide glimpses of a more systematic approach to captured women. In his annals, he frequently lists their women, their sons, their daughters among the booty taken from conquered cities. These women were not simply killed, they were absorbed into the Assyrian economy and society in ways that further served the empire's goals. One of the most revealing sources from Shalmaneser's reign is not a royal inscription but a monumental relief from the palace gates at Nimrud, known as the Balawat Gates. These bronze bands depict scenes from his campaigns, including the capture of cities and the procession of captives. Women are shown being led away with children, sometimes riding in carts, sometimes walking in lines with their hands bound. The visual record complements the textual. Women were a primary category of booty. Sennacherib, the destruction of Babylon and the women of the south. Perhaps no Assyrian king is more infamous in Western tradition than Sennacherib 704 to 681 BCE, whose siege of Jerusalem is recorded in the Hebrew Bible. But Sennacherib's campaigns extended far beyond Judah, and his treatment of captured women is documented in both Assyrian and biblical sources. Sennacherib's account of his campaign against Babylon is particularly revealing. After putting down a rebellion, he describes the sack of the city in terms of total destruction, and among the details, he notes the fate of the women. In his annals, he writes, "I carried off the people, young and old, male and female, the silver, the gold, the property, and the goods of Babylon. I destroyed the city and its houses, from foundation to parapet, I demolished them by fire." The phrase male and female is significant. While earlier kings often listed women as a separate category of booty, Sennacherib's inscriptions frequently specify that the entire population, men, women, children, was carried off. This reflects a shift toward mass deportation as a deliberate imperial policy, a practice that reached its peak under Sennacherib and his successors. Deportation was not merely about removing potential rebels. It was also about reshaping the demographic and economic landscape of the empire. Captured women and children were settled in newly established cities or given as rewards to Assyrian officials. They became weavers, agricultural laborers, and domestic servants. Their skills, particularly in textiles, were highly valued, and Assyrian palaces maintained vast workshops staffed by female captives from across the empire. The Hebrew Bible preserves an outside perspective on Sennacherib's methods. In 2 Kings 18-19, the Assyrian king's envoy, the Rabshakeh, addresses the people of Jerusalem in Hebrew, warning them of the consequences of resistance. He asks, "Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand?" The biblical account does not describe the fate of captured women in detail, but it reflects the terror that Assyrian methods inspired. The women of Jerusalem, the narrative implies, would face the same fate as the women of Samaria and other conquered cities, a fate left to the imagination but well understood by the original audience. Ashurbanipal, the last great conqueror. Ashurbanipal 668-627 BCE, the last of the great Assyrian kings, ruled at the Heif Assyrian Pa. His palace at Nineveh was adorned with reliefs depicting his campaigns with unprecedented detail, and his royal library preserved thousands of cuneiform tablets. His inscriptions are among the most extensive and boastful of any Assyrian ruler. Ashurbanipal's treatment of captured women is documented in his accounts of the campaigns against Elam, Assyria's eastern rival. After defeating the Elamite king Tuman, Ashurbanipal describes the fate of the royal family and the Elamite elite. In one inscription, he boasts, "I cut off the head of Tuman, their king, and I displayed it before them. I carried off his wives, his sons, his daughters, his property, his goods, his horses, his chariots, his weapons, and his warriors without number. The wives of the defeated king are taken as booty. What happened to them? The inscriptions do not specify, but other texts from Ashurbanipal's reign provide clues. In his account of the conquest of Babylon, which had rebelled again, he describes the fate of the Babylonian king's family. I carried off the women of the palace, the courtiers, the officials, the people of the land of Akkad, young and old, male and female without number. These women were integrated into the Assyrian imperial system. Some likely became part of the royal household. Others were assigned to workshops. The fates of royal women were often more politically charged. They could be married to Assyrian officials or used as pawns in diplomatic arrangements, but they could also be subjected to public humiliation or violence as a demonstration of Assyrian supremacy. One of the most disturbing textual references comes from Ashurbanipal's treatment of the Arabian tribes. In his campaign against the Arabs, he claims to have captured the queen of the Arabs and brought her to Nineveh. But more chillingly, he describes what he did to the women of the defeated tribes. I tore out the tongues of those who spoke insolently against Ashur my god. The rest of the people I brought to Assyria. I set up a pillar of their members. The phrase "a pillar of their members" likely refers to a pillar of severed body parts, a practice documented in earlier Assyrian reliefs, which show piles of severed hands, heads, and other body parts. The inclusion of women in such mutilations is implied in the broader context of total punishment. The visual evidence. The palace reliefs, images of captivity. The Assyrian palace reliefs provide a visual counterpart to the inscriptions. These monumental stone panels, which lined the walls of the palaces at Nimrud and Nineveh, depicted the king's campaigns with vivid detail. They were meant to be seen by visitors, foreign emissaries, tribute bearers, and Assyrian elites, and they served as a form of propaganda, projecting an image of Assyrian power that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Among the reliefs, images of captives are ubiquitous. Men, women, and children are shown in scenes of deportation, forced labor, and execution. The women are depicted in ways that emphasize their vulnerability and their status as booty. One of the most famous reliefs from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud shows a scene of deportation. Women and children are shown being led away by Assyrian soldiers. The women wear long garments and their heads are uncovered, a detail that may indicate their status as captives rather than free women. They are not shown being physically abused in this particular relief, but their posture, heads bowed, hands raised or bound, conveys submission. Other reliefs are more explicit. From the palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh, a series of panels depicts the siege and capture of the city of Lachish, an event also mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. One panel shows the inhabitants of Lachish being led out of the city after its fall. Women and children are shown riding in carts, while men are led on foot, some with their hands bound. The women's faces are not individualized, they are depicted as a group, a mass of humanity reduced to booty. Perhaps the most disturbing visual evidence comes from the reliefs of Ashurbanipal's palace at Nineveh. One famous panel shows the Assyrian king and his queen dining in a garden, while the severed head of the Elamite king Tumen hangs from a tree. The scene is not gratuitous, it is a carefully composed image of triumph, but it underscores the way that Assyrian art normalized extreme violence. Other reliefs from Ashurbanipal's reign show scenes of forced labor. Captive women are depicted grinding grain, carrying water, or working in textile workshops. These images are not scenes of explicit violence, but they convey the transformation of free women into property, their labor harnessed to the Assyrian state. The absence of explicit sexual violence in official art. One notable feature of the Assyrian reliefs is the relative absence of explicit depictions of sexual violence. Unlike the inscriptions, which boast of burning, mutilating, and carrying off women, the reliefs rarely show acts of rape or sexual humiliation. This is likely a matter of artistic convention, not historical reality. Assyrian art was highly formalized and served a specific propagandistic purpose. Scenes of sexual violence may have been considered inappropriate for monumental palace decoration, or they may have been deemed less impressive than scenes of military prowess and royal triumph. However, the absence of explicit imagery does not mean that sexual violence was absent. The inscriptions provide ample evidence, and the broader context of ancient warfare, in which captured women were routinely subjected to sexual violence, suggests that Assyrian practice was no exception. Moreover, the language of the inscriptions, with its conflation of conquest and sexual domination, implies a culture in which the sexual subjugation of captured women was understood and expected. The fate of captured women. Categories of captivity. To understand what Assyrian kings did to captured women, we must move beyond the inscription's boasts and consider the range of fates that awaited women who fell into Assyrian hands. The textual and archaeological evidence suggests that captured women were sorted into categories based on their age, status, skills, and appearance. Execution. Some women were killed outright. The inscriptions mention burning young men and women with fire, and in some contexts, mass executions are implied. Women who resisted, who were associated with rebel leaders, or who were simply deemed expendable could be killed. The public nature of these executions, bodies displayed, heads piled, body parts impaled, served as a warning to others. Sexual violence. The inscriptions do not frequently describe rape explicitly, but the context makes it clear that sexual violence was a routine aspect of the treatment of captured women. In ancient warfare, the rape of captured women was so common as to be nearly universal. Assyrian soldiers, like soldiers throughout history, treated captured women as spoils of war. Moreover, the language of the inscriptions, the boast of carrying off women, the description of women as booty, implies that women were subject to the sexual demands of their captors. The fate of royal women was particularly precarious. When a king was defeated, his wives and daughters were taken by the Assyrian king. Some were absorbed into the Assyrian royal household. Others were given to Assyrian officials. Still others were subjected to public humiliation, paraded through the streets of Nineveh, forced to serve as labours in full view of the population. Deportation and resettlement. Mass deportation was a hallmark of Assyrian imperial policy. Entire populations were uprooted and resettled in other parts of the empire. Women and children were central to this policy, as they were less likely to organize resistance than adult men. Deported women were often settled in newly constructed cities, where they were expected to assimilate into Assyrian society. Over generations, these deportees lost their original identities and became Assyrian subjects. The scale of deportation was enormous. Sennacherib claims to have deported 200,150 people from Babylon and its surrounding territories. Ashurbanipal similarly claims to have deported vast numbers from Elam. Women made up a significant portion of these deportees. Forced labor. Many captured women were assigned to labor in Assyrian palaces and households. The textile industry was particularly reliant on female labor. Assyrian palaces maintained large workshops where women, both Assyrian and foreign, produced woolen and linen textiles. These textiles were valuable commodities used for tribute trade. And gifts. Women captives with weaving skills were especially prized. Other women worked as grinders of grain, bakers, brewers, or domestic servants. Some were assigned to the households of Assyrian officials and soldiers. Their labor enriched the Assyrian elite and freed Assyrian women for other activities. Incorporation into Assyrian society. Over time, some captured women were integrated into Assyrian society. They could marry Assyrian men, bear children, and become part of Assyrian households. Their children, born in Assyria, would be Assyrian subjects. This process of assimilation was intentional. By absorbing foreign populations, the Assyrian Empire expanded its demographic base and diluted the identities of conquered peoples. However, integration did not mean equality. Foreign women remained marked by their origin. They were often given Assyrian names, but they were never fully Assyrian. Their status as captives could be held against them, and their children might be considered of lower status. The human reality. The voices of the women. The Assyrian inscriptions tell us what the kings did, but they do not tell us what the women experienced. The women themselves left no records. They were, for the most part, illiterate, and even if they had been able to write, they would have had no audience. The Assyrian Empire was not interested in their stories. But we can imagine, with care and respect, what their lives were like. A woman from a conquered city, let us call her by a common West Semitic name, like Shalman, would have experienced the Assyrian conquest in a series of escalating horrors. First came the siege. She would have watched from the city walls as the Assyrian army approached, a vast host of soldiers, siege engines, and camp followers. The sound of battering rams, the whistle of sling stones, the fire of torches. The terror of knowing that if the city fell, there would be no mercy. When the walls were breached, the killing began. Assyrian soldiers moved through the streets, slaughtering anyone who resisted. Her husband, if he was a soldier or a man of fighting age, was likely killed. Her sons, if they were old enough to be considered a threat, were killed or taken. Her daughters, they were taken too. She was seized, probably by a soldier, and dragged out of the city. Around her, other women were being gathered. Some were wounded. Some were crying. Some were silent, already beyond fear. Children clung to their mothers. The elderly, those who could not keep up, were killed on the spot. She was taken to the Assyrian camp, where the sorting began. The soldiers claimed their prizes. Some women were taken by the men who had captured them, to be used as they wished. Others were herded together, to be distributed later. In the camp, she would have been subjected to the demands of her captors. The threat of violence, of being killed, of having her children killed, was constant. She learned quickly that survival depended on compliance. When the campaign was over, she was marched to Assyria. The journey was long, weeks or months on foot, with little food and water. Those who could not keep up were left to die. The dead lined the roads. When she arrived at her destination, perhaps Nineveh, perhaps Nimrud, perhaps a newly founded city in the Assyrian heartland, she was assigned to a household or a workshop. In the workshop, she worked from dawn to dusk, spinning wool or weaving cloth. She was given just enough food to keep her alive. She lived in crowded quarters with other women, some from her own city, others from places she had never heard of. They spoke different languages, but they learned to communicate, through gestures, through shared misery. She never returned home. Home no longer existed. Her city was destroyed, its walls broken, its temples burned. The land was now Assyrian territory. The gods she had worshipped were defeated, or so the Assyrians said. She lived the rest of her life in captivity. Perhaps she bore children, children fathered by Assyrian men, children who would grow up speaking Akkadian, worshipping Assyrian gods, considering themselves Assyrian. Perhaps she died young, worn out by labor and grief. Perhaps she lived long enough to see her grandchildren born free, or as free as any Assyrian subject could be. We will never know her name. The Assyrian records do not mention individuals. They mention only numbers, the hundreds of thousands of people carried off, the women counted among the booty. She was, to the scribes who recorded the king's deeds, a statistic. The children of captivity. The children of captured women faced their own set of challenges. Some were taken from their mothers at a young age, to be raised as Assyrians. Others remained with their mothers but were marked by their foreign origin. They were often given Assyrian names, a sign of their incorporation into the empire. But the children of captives were not necessarily condemned to a life of servitude. Over generations, descendants of deportees could rise to positions of prominence. The Assyrian Empire was, in some ways, a meritocracy, or at least, it valued loyalty and competence above origin. A child born to a captive woman but raised in an Assyrian household might become a soldier, a scribe, even an official. Yet the shadow of captivity never fully lifted. Assyrian society was stratified, and origin mattered. The children of foreign women were sometimes referred to by terms that marked their status. They were sons of captives or sons of no one. They occupied a liminal space between freedom and servitude. Scholarly perspectives. Gender and Assyrian imperialism. Modern scholarship has increasingly focused on the gender dimensions of Assyrian imperialism. Historians like Sarah C. Melville, Zaina Bing, and Sanana Svard have explored how Assyrian texts and art constructed gender and used gender as a tool of imperial ideology. Zainab Bani, in particular, has argued that Assyrian representations of conquest are deeply imbued with gendered metaphors. The conquered city is often feminized, described as a woman who is taken, entered, laid open. The Assyrian king, by contrast, is hypermasculine, powerful, aggressive, virile. The conquest is thus figured as a form of sexual domination. This metaphorical framework had real consequences for the women of conquered cities. If the city itself was imagined as a woman, then the actual women of the city became symbols of the city's defeat. Their bodies were the ground on which Assyrian dominance was enacted. To violate them was to violate the city, to take them as booty was to demonstrate the king's absolute power. The economics of captivity. Other scholars have focused on the economic role of captured women. The Assyrian Empire was built on extraction, tribute booty, and labor from conquered territories sustained the Assyrian state and funded its monumental building projects. Women captives were a key part of this economic system. The textile industry was particularly important. Assyrian textiles were highly prized throughout the ancient Near East, and they served as a major source of wealth. The production of these textiles depended on female labor, both Assyrian women and foreign captives. The palace workshops at Nimrud and Nineveh employed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of women, many of them deported from conquered lands. The economic value of women captives is reflected in the inscriptions, which list women alongside silver, gold, and livestock. Women were not merely symbols of conquest, they were a form of wealth, to be counted, distributed, and exploited. The Assyrian imperial system. The treatment of captured women must also be understood within the broader context of Assyrian imperial administration. The Assyrian Empire was not simply a military machine, it was a sophisticated administrative system that integrated conquered territories into a centralized state. Deportation was a tool of this integration. By moving populations, the Assyrians broke down old loyalties and created a more homogeneous subject population. Women were central to this process. As mothers, they raised the next generation of subjects. As labours, they contributed to the Assyrian economy. As captives, they served as a constant reminder of Assyrian power. The Assyrian state did not simply conquer, it transformed, reshaping the demographics and social structures of the ancient Near East. The aftermath. The legacy of Assyrian practices. The Assyrian Empire fell in the late 7th century BCE, its capital cities destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others. But the memory of Assyrian brutality lived on. The Hebrew Bible preserves that memory in the stories of Sennacherib's campaign against Judah and the fall of Samaria. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing more than a century after Assyria's fall, recorded stories of Assyrian cruelty. The practices pioneered by the Assyrian kings, mass deportation, the use of terror as a tool of imperial control, the systematic exploitation of captive populations, were adopted by later empires, including the Neo-Babylonian, Persian, and Roman empires. The treatment of captured women, in particular, continued to be a feature of ancient warfare. But the Assyrians were among the first to systematize it, to make it a matter of state policy rather than merely the spontaneous violence of soldiers. Confronting the past. To study Assyrian treatment of captured women is to confront a difficult truth, that human cruelty is not a deviation from civilization but often its companion. The Assyrians built magnificent cities, developed sophisticated administrative systems, produced art of extraordinary beauty, and preserved knowledge in their vast libraries. They also committed acts of violence that, by any standard, constitute crimes against humanity. We cannot undo what was done. But we can remember, and in remembering, we can honor the women whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was celebrated by their conquerors, whose bodies were used to build an empire. We can recognize that their experience was not an ancient anomaly but part of a longer history of gendered violence in war that continues to this day. And we can ask ourselves, what does it mean that the Assyrian kings considered their treatment of captured women something to boast about? What does it mean that they carved these boasts into stone, where they would be seen for millennia? And what does it mean that we, today, can read those boasts with horror? It means that we have changed, or at least, we have changed in some ways. The public celebration of sexual violence against captives is no longer acceptable in most of the world. The idea that women are legitimate booty of war has been rejected, at least in principle, by international law. We have made progress. But the Assyrian inscriptions remind us that progress is fragile. The attitudes that allowed Assyrian kings to boast of burning women with fire, of carrying off the wives of their enemies, of mutilating and humiliating captives, these attitudes have not disappeared. They lie beneath the surface, ready to emerge in times of conflict. To study the Assyrian treatment of captured women is to be reminded of what humans are capable of, and to recommit ourselves to ensuring that such atrocities are not repeated. The unimaginable made visible. What Assyrian kings did to captured women was, in the words of the question that prompted this account, unimaginable. And yet, we have imagined it, or at least, we have approached it through the fragmentary evidence that survives. The inscriptions, the reliefs, the archaeological remains, and the scholarly analysis allow us to reconstruct, with some clarity, the system of violence that Assyrian kings deployed against the women of conquered peoples. We have seen that this violence was not random or uncontrolled. It was systematic, ideological, and economically driven. It was justified by a worldview in which the Assyrian king was the instrument of divine punishment, and the suffering of the conquered was a demonstration of cosmic order. It was carried out by soldiers who had been trained to see captives as property. It was recorded by scribes who counted women among the booty, alongside silver and gold. We have seen that women faced a range of fates: execution, sexual violence, deportation, forced labor, and, in some cases, eventual integration into Assyrian society. Each of these fates was a form of violence, an erasure of identity, a transformation of a free person into property. Even when women survived, they did so at immense cost. And we have seen that the Assyrian treatment of captured women was not an isolated phenomenon but part of a broader system of imperial terror. The Assyrian Empire was built on the suffering of conquered peoples, and women bore a particular burden within that system. To say that what Assyrian kings did to captured women was unimaginable is, in a sense, true. We cannot fully imagine the experience of a woman seized from her home, marched across the desert, and set to labor in a foreign palace, surrounded by people who spoke a different language and worshipped different gods. We cannot fully imagine the terror of being sorted, the humiliation of being treated as property, the grief of losing children, the despair of knowing that one's homeland had been erased. But we can try. We can try to imagine, because to refuse to imagine is to refuse to confront the reality of what was done. And to confront that reality, to look directly at the boasts of Assyrian kings, at the images of captives on palace walls, at the lists of women carried off as booty, is to take the first step toward understanding not only Assyrian history but also the darker currents of human history as a whole. The Assyrian kings intended their inscriptions to be read for all time. They wanted future generations to know of their power, their conquests, their punishments. They carved their boasts into stone, buried prisms in the foundations of their palaces, and lined their walls with reliefs of their triumphs. They wanted to be remembered. And they are remembered. But not, perhaps, as they intended. We remember them not only for their achievements, the cities, the libraries, the art, but also for their cruelty. We remember them as the builders of an empire founded on terror. And we remember, in particular, the women whose suffering they celebrated. In remembering, we bear witness. And in bearing witness, we affirm that the women who suffered under Assyrian rule, whose names we do not know, whose voices we cannot hear, deserve to be remembered. They were not merely booty, not merely statistics, not merely symbols of Assyrian power. They were human beings, with hopes and fears, loves and losses, dignity and worth. Their suffering matters. And it is our task, as historians and as human beings, to confront it with honesty and humility. This is what the Assyrian kings did to captured women. It is a dark chapter in human history. But it is a chapter that we must read, and read with care, if we are to understand not only the Assyrian Empire but also the enduring capacity for cruelty and for compassion that defines our shared humanity.